So the question is, most direct action groups like XR and Just Stop Oil or Insulate Britain, etc., are all open and accept the punishment of the state for their actions and never resist arrest. What are your thoughts on the tactics and effectiveness of groups that operate secretly and avoid being caught, such as the tire extinguishers? So it's for both of you.
You want to go first, Oscar? You go for it.
You go.
Okay, fine. Yeah, I think it depends probably a bunch on, again, like the outcomes you're going for. I think if your goal is just to like impose direct economic costs to businesses and not get caught and keep doing this for a long period of time, yes, maybe fine. But I think if you care about changing public opinion or getting media coverage or like changing policymakers, I think it's probably less ideal, because I don't know, I think not having people behind your group makes you like less personable. Who gives the quotes? There's no human like interaction, and like I think generally people, like the public, would be more skeptical or like more distrustful of like faceless kind of shadowy organizations. So I think it's probably not ideal in terms of like, also like if you want to build a movement and get people to join your cause, it's much harder to recruit if you're like closed and very insular and secretive. So I think probably it won't do amazingly on most outcomes unless you really just want to cause economic disruption and damage and do this for a long period of time. But yeah, so I think I lean more towards like public, open, accountable things, because I think it's probably better on the other stuff, which I think is maybe more important. But obviously depends on your theory of change, I think.
Yeah, so I mean, obviously that kind of hidden, masked up protest is a lot more kind of connected to anarchist protest traditionally. And I mean, I don't think there's anything ethically wrong with it. I mean, if you mask up and blow up a pipeline or whatever, I don't think that's a wrong thing to do. I know that a lot of activists actually use the openness as a form of protection for themselves as well, because it's so difficult to do things entirely covertly that if you get caught doing it, you're going to be, I suppose it becomes easier and more legitimate for the state to punish you harder if you do it that way than if you are open with it. So I know that's what, for example, when Just Stop Oil have smashed up petrol stations and things like that they kind of intentionally didn't hide their faces and so on.
Yeah, there is another question to you, Oscar. You said that authoritarian backlash has proved Hallam wrong. Could you explain that?
Okay.
Yeah, there is a bipart to this question. It is not possible that this just is it not possible that this is just an effect of polarization and that people will eventually turn against the state and the authoritarian repression of protest? Many people are very concerned about climate change after all, but please continue.
Yeah, so I suppose I think he did foresee, if you read his stuff, that, there would be increased state repression. But I suppose what we haven't seen yet is that's increased state repression leads to more people getting engaged in this kind of activism. Of course, you can always say, will it come? Well, maybe. But I suppose that he had a very linear way of seeing how things would work, and just the way that they were talking about it as, having the secret code for how to do protest, how to change the world, and in an almost kind of prophet-like kind of way, that is, you make yourself hostage to fortune, that, a lot of those, the kind of things that he predicted haven't happened, and then he's changed tack and so on in some ways. But I think that, I don't see I think that the kind of activism that a lot of you are involved in will continue, obviously, and that there will be more people starting to do it. But we haven't seen, and I don't think that we will necessarily see, huge amounts of people engaging in that. And particularly, you know, the kind of thing that was, you know, when 6,000 people were with Extinction Rebellion in central London in April 2019, which changed things, right? Like that's, and when the kind of tiny opinion poll, you know, kind of changes that James points out, Extinction Rebellion in April 2019 achieved much more than that, right? They achieved a really significant shift in public concern about climate change. And that wasn't, you know, brought about by, you know, that was a kind of moment. It was a political moment. And often I think activists are searching for these kind of political moments when kind of everything kind of changes. And some of the literature talks about these. And we can see, you know, just, you know, in the last kind of 10, 15 years, we can see, you know, like 2011, I mean, my PhD was about Spanish politics and, you know, Spanish protests and so on. And there we could see how the Indignados in 2011 kind of did also kind of shifted something quite big in the political system. I often think also recently about, you know, Chile 2019 with the big protests there and so on. And I think that Extinction Rebellion in 2019 was such a moment. And obviously Roger Hallam and many others were instrumental to making that kind of moment happen. But it's very difficult to replicate. And I think that's what Extinction Rebellion are really struggling with now. Obviously they're planning a big protest in London. How big will it be? What effect will it have? I'm not sure. We'll soon know. But those kind of political moments are difficult to replicate. But I think that the kind of very radical activism that some of you are involved in is not, you know, it's never going to involve huge amounts of people. It's, you know, that, and I mean, you know, like, because it's such huge risk to yourselves. Yeah, that means that, you know, what you can hope for with that kind of thing is the kind of radical flank effect that James talks about, I suppose, where other people can use the space, the political space that is opened up by it.
So I'll take another question here. The high numbers in participation and impact in early XR could be a novelty effect. Black Lives Matter also had an enormous peak and then less activity. How can we make movements last? Or should we reinvent ourselves constantly?
You can't make movements last, not those kind of political moments that I talked about. These things always go in waves, and, you know, people have lives to get back to and jobs to do and things. So you can't do that. Of course, sometimes these get, you know, institutionalized, and you can and you know, it's important then to also kind of engage in that kind of more institutionalized politics, if that's, you know, what you believe in. What you can hope is for it to have a kind of lasting effect. So we can see that, you know, 2019 Chilean protests led to a change in government, a left-wing president, led to a vote for constitution that was then lost, right? So, you know, the new Chilean constitution was not voted in. So, you know, that's a kind of step back. But I mean, I think often, you know, you can't just rely on people's free time and so on. Like, if you're going to see actual change, then you need to have, you know, institutional politics and so on. I actually often think about, you know, as a Swede, I often think about, well, and when people talk about this with, you know, radical flank and all that kind of stuff, well, all social change is kind of has a bunch of actors that are kind of pulling in similar directions, but have a lot of different kind of agendas or visions of how that change will happen, and it's seldom the most radical of those actors that get their way. And you know, there are a whole lot of processes that play into it, and you know, I often think about, well, how, you know, the creation of the Swedish welfare state, or indeed the welfare state in a lot of Europe, was obviously, you know, one of the biggest shifts to the left that we've seen kind of states do. And obviously that was, you know, partly done in order to stop the communists, right? It was in order to, you know, stop Sweden being emulating the Russian Revolution. And that's the kind of, you know, like, it's as obviously as an activist, you don't have the kind of power. It's not just about the strategies that you do, or the tactics that you do. You can't bring that kind of thing about. Your agency matters, but you're also part of much broader structures that you have to take into account. And I suppose that's what I try to encourage people to do, to try to analyze where do we fit in this, and how can our agency make a difference to the different social and political forces that exist around us. And not least, I mean, in terms of climate change, like, it's quickly deteriorating climate, that we know some of the pressures that it will put on us. You know, we know that food will be an issue at some point. We don't know when it will be, but you know, how do we kind of deal with those, and what are our answers to them?
Thank you. And thank you, James, for the link to Movement Action Plan. We have actually talked about that on previous discussions. So I will give you the next question, because it seems to be heading your way. Besides measuring public opinion, have you found any other available and relevant way of measuring the effects of actions or campaigns that you would recommend? Big public polls are impressive, but so costly that they're in practice aren't very available as a measuring tool for grassroots groups.
Yeah, this is a great question, and I think this is a really tough problem. And yeah, so like, public opinion polls are costly, and it's like, yes, you can't just do them all the time, because it's just, yeah, no one has that kind of money. Yeah, I think like some things that groups can, like, again, it matters what you care about, but I think most people care about like internal, like, size and movement growth. So whether it's like the more superficial things, like people on the mailing list, or like people actively in groups, number of local groups, it's kind of like movement building kind of metrics, I think are fairly easy to measure, because we can have access over that. And I think people care about this stuff quite a lot. So I think having just a good sense of, like, you can think of it as like the breadth and the depth of your movement. So like, how wide is it, and how committed are people in the movement. So I think these kind of metrics, literally like how many hours, like how many part-time or full-time volunteers, how many hours everyone's spending, just all this kind of stuff, I think is useful on that side of things. But then I think besides that, it gets quite tricky, because some things, again, often the effects of your campaigns won't be noticed for like maybe a while afterwards. Like, you'll do a campaign, you'll do stuff, and you might not hear anything for the next year, and then you look back and be like, oh, actually, now I see everyone's using the words climate emergency, or everyone's talking about insulation. Isn't that convenient? But at the time, you'll have no idea that this is happening, because you're in the thick of it, and you can't do this evaluation. So I think for ongoing stuff, I think the best stuff is just kind of things that people joining, and like internal metrics. And when you look back maybe a year back, it's stuff like discourse. How often, like, are you trying to push like forward certain ideas, certain new campaigns, certain like discourse and narrative trends? Maybe that's one thing. Another one is like, depending on if you want to do this, like if this is something you care about, is kind of coalitions. Like, to what degree do different groups work with you, want to work with you? Do, like, if you want to be with policymakers, are they supporting you? But yeah, I think this is a really hard question, so I don't have a particularly good answer. I don't know if Oscar, you've got stuff to add on that.
No, I mean, I would say one thing that about seeing in the chat, you know, about copying tactics, and one really big, you know, having lived in the UK and in Sweden, one huge difference is that a lot of these people that are broadly on the left in the UK, they don't trust the state very much, whereas Swedes have a huge trust in the state. So as somebody doing direct action, you have a tougher job convincing people that it's the right thing to do in Sweden than in the UK, as in the people that you want to kind of pull with you are, I think, culturally harder to do in Sweden through using these tactics.
Thank you. During our previous strategy conversation that we had within XR Sweden, we talked about different tactics, and we divided it into disturbing the public and not disturbing the public, and direct action that doesn't harm ordinary people, or direct actions that do harm. When I say harm, cause some kind of disruption to them. Yeah, so do you have any thoughts about that? Do you prefer one in front of the other when it comes to disturbing the public, direct action? Do you want to go first, James? Yeah.
Oh, I thought I was going to go. Yeah, I know. I find it really hard to answer these questions, even though I think this is like an extremely important and relevant question. But I think what Oscar was kind of saying before, it's not clear there's like ever a right answer. It's so contextual, and yeah, I think like done well, they can both be really good, but it's just, I think how you do them. It's like, for example, like I'm not like a huge fan of like blocking like M25 motorway stuff, because that feels like very indiscriminate. It's not clear how that's helping. But then some other stuff that was like publicly disruptive, like let's say what XR did, like with huge numbers, that seems like much more beneficial. So I think there's like other variables involved. It's like how big is the action, like how clear is that action logic, like how well is it targeted, that kind of stuff. But I think, yeah, I'm reading the question again, but I think that's, yeah, I don't have a good answer. I think this is $1 million question. I think if we knew, we'd be fine. We sold, but we don't. I don't know, Oscar, what do you have to say?
Do you have a $1 million answer, Oscar?
I don't think that anybody should stop blocking roads. I mean, blocking roads and traffic is an age-old protest tactic, and by that I mean, hundreds and hundreds of years old. I mean, that has been used across the world. So I don't think that you can definitely not say that that's a wrong thing to do, and it has often achieved things, right? So my colleague Colin Davis at Bristol, that I'm working on with these things, he looked at media coverage about home insulation in Britain after the Insulate Britain protests on the M25, and saw a real uptake in like a big increase in the amount that people were that this was talked about in the media, and then it's kind of come into political policy programs and so on of the Labour Party since then. Of course, if you ask them, they'll say no, it had nothing to do with Insulate Britain, but because våtmarker, it's such a thing that obviously this is a good idea to do. You have to be stupid not to, or a climate change denier, in order to be against these kind of policies. So I think that in these cases, those kind of things obviously have been useful. I think it's damaging when you see clashes with kind of working people, because if you think about what we need is a kind of just transition and climate justice, then we don't want the climate change movement to be in Britain, the kind of white middle class movement that is often that annoys workers, for example. And I mean, that's what happened a lot in the October 2019, when some Extinction Rebellion activists got on top of a commuter train in one of the sort of in quite a working class part of London, in Canning Town, and that was created a big backlash with little positive effect. And I think we've seen some such videos when people carry away Just Stop Oil protests, people who are evidently, I mean, being carried away by the police, that's good, right? You're doing a good thing. Being carried away by somebody trying to get to work, or somebody trying to do like a delivery, or like a Deliveroo driver or an Amazon driver who is paid by their for every delivery, that's bad, right? That's not who the enemy is. And I don't think that's a good thing. That's not something that is going to build any good alliances. But roadblocks in general, you can't say are bad, because many times they've had good effects.
Thank you very much. I just had a question here that I got. I think this is the one. What are your thoughts on different actors within the movement renouncing other actors or groups or methods? The latest example from Germany, the German CEO of the WWF, who accept money from fossil companies, renouncing the Letzte Generation for covering a public monument for the constitution with fake oil.
Okay, maybe I can go first on this one. Yeah, I think in a way this is kind of what you'd expect. It's kind of like the radical flank effect, where essentially this much more moderate group is saying, oh no, like they're too radical, but you can support me instead, and like I'm the nice friendly face of climate change, yada yada yada. So I think in that way it could be positive, but I think the person also has I think I would more expect that to happen, rather than, I think that maybe Justus is maybe implying that this could weaken movements. But I think, I don't know, I think that seems like a broadly positive thing, as in like, not broadly positive. It's obviously not good he's doing this, but I don't think this will like make Last Generation be like, oh my God, much worse in public image. But I don't know, I could be totally wrong. Because I think in a way, the more and more groups like Last Generation are pushing the envelope, I think that is positive. Like people like expanding what their view of is moderate climate action, and if anything, the WWF person will look more like too moderate, too weak, too whatever. So yeah, I don't say it's like a huge con.
Yeah, I have limited respect for WWF, but for some of the reasons that you say. But basically, I mean, of course, you kind of expect it, but that doesn't make it right. Like, I mean, I think, I certainly try to use a lot of the space that I get given in media to legitimize actors like you, and like, kind of radical climate activists, as something that is rational to do, largely, like that is and that is a good thing. And I think that other actors within the climate movement should learn to use the space that gets opened in a good way. I understand if some people find themselves, forced to, disagree with tactics and so on, but I think that there are different ways of doing that, and this also has to be seen in a context of that. You guys have been criminalized, right? Like, I mean, the pressures and the risks that you've been put on and that you put yourselves in are increasing, and their actors like that have a role to play. As I think the UN Secretary General has been very helpful in this way, in saying like, well, no, these are not the criminals. We don't need to be like distancing ourselves from like people engaging in this kind of activism. So whilst we can expect certain actors to do like that, I think both me and James use public space to defend and actors like this, and to try to get others to defend it. And our universities, like really, our institutions within my university are kind of have become very pro-activist, and in this sense, and I think they will want to be seen as kind of mainstream actors in many ways. So I think that's a political struggle as well to legitimize the role of radical activists.
Thank you. One last question from Finland. Elo Kapina. What is your opinion on the often discussed strategy of uniting forces with the workers' movement, trade unions? Any examples promising developments there or ideas?
So I think it's absolutely essential that that we see ourselves as part of a broad climate justice movement, and that climate justice doesn't necessarily start with climate or the environment, but that it can start with justice questions, and that the climate question is becoming increasingly unavoidable for all of us. So yes, I think that the workers' movement definitely is has to get involved more in climate change, in the climate struggle. And I am, I'm supervising a dissertation that's looking at a PhD that's looking at that in Turkey, and I know people working on it in Germany with obviously a huge car industry and so on. So yes, because workers are the people that are not going to be able to afford to buy a piece of land in New Zealand and build a bunker in. Yeah, if it's difficult to do now, it'll be easier in 5 years' time and easier in 10 years' time.
We might have time for some more questions. And one question is, something that speaks for arrests is civil disobedience as a communication signal with a high cost. Do you think that this is one of the way it works?
Yes, I suppose as for me, who criticized the kind of focus on arrests, I mean, that's clearly one way of doing it, and that can be useful, and that kind of showing of sacrifice, I think, has been useful. But there was in early Extinction Rebellion, there was a kind of goal of aiming for as many arrests as you can, and that just seemed absurd to me. And it came with a stated aim of trying to basically threaten the criminal justice system, as in basically fill the jails and so on, and these guys love repressing you. Don't give them the pleasure for the sake of it. That's you're not going to be able to threaten the functioning of the kind of criminal justice system in the way that those tactics kind of set out from the beginning. So that's, I suppose, one way in which I think that Hallemism has been proven wrong. But yes, of course, the act of showing yourself a worthy voice, and by doing this sacrifice, can in the moment absolutely have value.
Yeah, I think I agree that it shouldn't be the goal of itself. It's you want to do good, creative, important direct action, and if you get arrested, that's unfortunate. Not 3,000 arrests is our goal. Let's go. And actually, I think we did some research looking at this idea of commitments, and I think actually the studies that do look at either people getting arrested or the problems of commitments actually finds it's not a hugely important factor in terms of at least shifting people's perceptions of the issue or of the group. So it doesn't seem like the sacrificial element of it seems maybe as important as we previously thought, but also there's actually very little research on this, so it's literally a couple of studies here and there, so it could totally be wrong. But I think it's not there's really clear evidence that it's a really good tool, but also not the other way. So yeah, I think just basically not aiming for it as a goal seems useful.
Thank you very much. So like Ragnhild said in the beginning, we would like to hear some thoughts from you, Oscar and James, after this question round. What are your thoughts after having discussed these questions with XR Sweden and Finland and Norway, at least?
You go first, Oscar, then I'll go.
Pressure. So I think not to think that you can or should copy everything that other people do in other countries, that you are in your own political context, and it's important to take that into account. I think really pushed what the last question was about, that building alliances and seeing yourself as part of a broad coalition. So I mean, for my my fantasies about Swedish politics is basically that you have two political parties, to presumably to the left of the center-left party, or maybe not, but one Green party and one left party. That one is not red enough and one is not green enough, and that you need a kind of climate justice political force that is not there in parliamentary politics. So what can you do to bring about such a social and political force in Sweden in the next few years? That's what I would see as, if I was a climate activist in Sweden, that's what I would ask myself. What does, and particularly under these circumstances of a pretty far right government, then the many different injustices that are taking place. How can you build a kind of green left climate justice focused movement that spreads across institutional and extra institutional politics? So there you go. That's your challenge.
Nice. So maybe my thing, Esther, well, yes, I'm less involved now, but I worked full-time for XR for a couple of years in the UK as my background, and Animal Rebellion. But yeah, I think for me, I think what my big thing is like being clear on your theory of change is like, how do you expect the campaigns and actions you do to actually create the outcomes you want? And I get so surprised when I live with some friends who work for Just Stop Oil, and I ask them like, what's your theory of change? Like, how is this action going to like lead to things you want? And they're like, that's a good question. I'm like, what do you mean that's a good question? Like, you should have a really clear plan and idea of like, you do this and you expect these things to happen, and like, if it's good, great, you keep going. So just being really clear, like, do you care about media? Do you care about growing your movement? Do you care about policy? Do you care about like new campaigns, like shifting discourse, like installations? Just being really clear on that and then focusing on that, I think is useful. And then I think maybe this is something that I'm personally reflecting on, like having small wins, or at least like declaring your wins, I think is really important. Like people like moving forward and achieving stuff. And I think one drawback of XR having such ambitious goals was like, you never have a solid achievement or win, even though they did have some. And people get like disillusioned and leave and they're sad because you're not making progress. But actually, if you do some things that are achievable, or at least like, in say Britain, be like, yes, the government's now doing it, we won, next campaign. I think just being like clear, like we've achieved loads and we're going to achieve loads, and being focused on like the steps we're making, not just being like, oh, we want something that's so big it's never achievable. Yeah, and I think basically what Oscar said is doing something is usually better than doing nothing. So I think even if you're not sure whether the perfect action is roadblocking or something else, it's probably both better than doing nothing. So I would just keep going.
Okay, thank you very much for participating. Really happy to see so many people interesting in thinking about strategy and tactics. And a special thank you, of course, to James and Oscar, who presented your thoughts to us. It was really interesting. And then I hope to see all of you on the 20th of March at 7 p.m. when we will have an online meeting to talk more about this. It's a never-ending discussion.
Yeah, and that's more of a discussion after we've heard so much from you.
Exactly. So we'll all take with us what you brought up and reflect on it. So thank you very, very much, and have a good night.